Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the post-war made French K98Ks. I'm going to go over a little bit of the history and the reasoning behind this rifle. So the Mauser Oberndorf factory in Germany during World War II produced a lot more than just the K98K rifle. They produced pistols, they produced Lugers, P38s, they produced machine guns, they produced gun parts, they produced machine guns for planes. They really did a lot. It was kind of a pretty massive complex of factories and machine works. So now at the end of World War II, around April 17th, 1945, the Oberndorf factory just shut down. Allied troops were very, very close by. And just 3 days later, the French army came in and occupied the town of Oberndorf, Germany. And so the Mauser factory is now in French hands. The French knew what they captured. The French knew about the Mauser factory, of course. And pretty soon after, taking over the town of Oberndorf, they set up a joint French-German management team to go in and figure out how they could ramp up production again at the Mauser factory. And by the end of May, production had already started. So here you're going from a time period of right at the end of World War II. You got the Battle of Berlin going on, the surrender. And then pretty soon after the surrender of Germany, the Mauser factory begins production again, of course, this time under French occupation. Now for the French, the Mauser factory made K98Ks. They continued production of P38s. They made 22 trainers. They made some machine guns and some other things. So the Mauser factory was kind of up and running again right afterwards. Pretty much the same people doing the same jobs that they had been doing during the war. Pretty much guns of all phases were there. So you have just basically, spare parts like barrels and receivers and bolts and stuff like that, all the way to rifles that were just completely assembled, that were just already been accepted and were just still sitting at the factory, and everything in between. So the French pretty much accepted guns through the whole plethora. Also, there are quite a bit of guns there that were there to be reworked or re-arsenaled. Maybe they're guns that taken damage and they were just there to get fixed. The French just took everything. They accepted all these guns once they went through the process. Now most of the French K98Ks made at the factory have the receiver code of SVWMB. There are some earlier guns there too, like just SVW 45s, and there's some other, random codes there from previous years, just because the guns just happen to be there to get, maybe to get fixed. So it's possible to run into all sorts of different receiver codes, but the great majority of them, especially all the new production guns, are all going to be that SVWMB. Now SVWMB was just the latest receiver code that the Germans came up with. They didn't want to put the factory names on the guns for military purposes, so they would sort of make these codes to put on the guns to kind of keep the location or where these guns were made secret from the Allies. And the latest one, of course, was just SVWMB. Right before that, SVW45. Right before that, you have BYF. Before that, 42. Before that, S/42. And then a few more behind that. So there's a whole string of receiver codes that's possible to find these in. Interestingly enough, the French-made P38s, their codes are SVW45 and SVW46, obviously for the years that they were made. So there's not like a real serious uniformity. Some of this just seems kind of leftover nomenclature from the war. Now during the late war, 1945, pretty much the Kriegsmodel style of K98K was in full swing. You can identify the Kriegsmodels because they have the lack of the takedown disc in the stock. So there's a hole in the buttstock. There's no bayonet lug attachment or cleaning rod. A lot of these parts, instead of being made of instead of a milled sort of H-band in the front, you'll just kind of find a rather crude stamped bands on the guns. So being that it's a Kriegsmodel, of course these guns, they don't have the bayonet lugs and the cleaning rods. But the French want their stacking rods on the guns, so the French actually manufactured this sort of stamped stacking rod piece that screws into the end of the stock here. That is missing on this gun. However, it's just a pretty straightforward piece of sheet metal. Now when the French took over Mauser production, they just continued the serial production that was already in progress there. So you can find these earlier SVWMB K98Ks that are just full German production guns, up until about the C suffix or the C block. After that, it's going to most likely be a French-made gun, and you do find French K98Ks before the C blocks. So I think it's guns that were sort of made earlier and weren't finished, or maybe guns that were rejects that the French just sort of, finished assembly on and accepted. Now the serial blocks for these guns is going to be A, B, C, D, H, and K. So you'll typically find, a string of numbers, up to 5 numbers with a prefix, an A through K prefix on these guns. This is a really late one, so this is a K prefix. They ended their production around the K prefix. Now by June of 1946, the French completely shut down all production at the Mauser factory. Apparently one of the rumors is that it was from Russian pressure that the French decided to just cease production. They packed up all the machinery and equipment, and they moved that out, and they just demolished, destroyed pretty much the whole factory complex. They left the Mauser Hallmark building. They left that intact and a few other ancillary buildings. So it's nice that we still have the Hallmark building, but pretty much everything else was destroyed. So the French produced 51,118 newly assembled rifles. They sort of made 9,282 rifles from either incomplete or partially complete guns at the factory. So for a total of 60,400 guns. So 60,400 Mausers. Specifically K98Ks, the French pumped out of the Mauser factory there at the very end. So there's a good bit of these now out there. They're not super common in the United States. When you find them, they tend to go for pretty big money. When you get them, you want to kind of make sure that they have the stacking rod with them, because apparently quite a few of the stacking rods were removed. I don't know if they just were taken out by like maybe the average civilian gun owner didn't like the way it looked, and so they took it off, or if they broke off, or soldiers removed them or something. Not exactly sure how those came off, but when you find them, you want to make sure that it's got that. Now, just as a shooter, I prefer the French style of sling much more to the German one. The actual sling itself is much thicker, which is a lot more comfortable for carrying it around. And the German side sling placement here, it has this keeper that sticks through the side of the stock. So whenever you're sort of, grabbing the semi-pistol grip of the stock, you kind of end up getting a half sort of handful of sling down here. So with this French style of sling, really nice. You don't get any of that. You just get, just grab basically, all stock. And you can see how much thicker the French sling here is. It's just overall a much nicer sling, I think. Now let's do some close-ups and do some comparisons between the French and the German-produced K98K. So first thing you'll probably notice is this Mod 98, for model of 98, the Mauser that this is. Now this marking on earlier guns is found down here on the side rail, but towards the end of the war, the German factories started moving that here up to the top. Then right underneath that, you can probably make out this SVWMB marking. And this is the very late war marking for the Mauser Oberndorf factory, and that carried over into the French production of these guns. You can see the serial numbers down here. Of course, afterwards we can see the suffix here. So for the K suffix, this was the last block made of serial numbers that you'll find. And then here we have the star, which is the proof mark or the acceptance stamp of the French, and that is different than the German-made guns here, because the German ones obviously had a little eagle here, depending on the vintage. So here we can compare just the overall finish and machining on the two Mausers. You can see that it's it's pretty nicely polished up here on this earlier Mauser. And it's a bit rough on this one here. Just pretty much these late war guns tend to be really rough. And the French didn't really put any extra steps into finishing these guns up to make them look nice. They didn't care. They just wanted functional guns. So they just sort of stayed in this rough condition. Here's a comparison of just the bands that are on the guns. So these earlier Mausers, of course, had these nicely milled steel components. And then these late war Kriegsmodel components are really just stamped and welded. And instead of using a band spring, these just use screws to just hold these in place. So it's much cruder on these later guns. So here's a MAS 36 on top, and we can tell that the French K98K pretty much has the identical sling placement as on this MAS 36 for obvious reasons. Here we can see a pretty big difference here in this nice earlier war, milled steel trigger guard and floor plate versus this, later stamped style of trigger guard and floor plate. And here we can see, of course, the original, nicely milled steel inlet. And this obviously was for, sticking in the bolt for disassembly. You can see here that this, rather crude just hole in the buttstock, works exactly the same as far as, disassembling your bolt. So I think this is pretty smart overall to switch to. And in general, I really love captured guns. I like the idea of guns that sort of served on both sides of a conflict. And so this gun kind of checks those boxes. You could be a German Mauser fan and collect this. You could be a French, military collector and collect this. It's one of those guns that kind of does, fill sort of multiple niches and different collections. So this is a gun I'm really happy to have in my collection, and I encourage you guys, if you see one of these, out and about, to consider purchasing it. Pretty neat gun. They're still an 8mm Mauser. The French, they didn't, chamber them in anything different, since they were just using leftover parts. There was plenty of German 8mm Mauser ordnance left over after the war for the French to use, so that wasn't a problem. If you want to know more about French Mausers or any other sort of late war German Mausers, Kriegsmodell, this is a really good book. It's a fairly recent Mauser book. It used to be Backbone of the Wehrmacht, was like the Mauser Bible to sort of go to for K98Ks. But they have a really good series of K98K books. This is just the Kriegsmodell one. Appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you next time.